Welcome, viewers, to this new episode of Beyond Phrenology. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Michael Spivey on our podcast. Dr. Spivey is a distinguished cognitive scientist known for his groundbreaking work in the field of cognitive dynamics. He's currently a professor at the University of California, Merced. His research explores how perception, action, and cognition are tightly integrated through dynamic processes. He has authored several influential publications. He has close to 20,000 citations, so hundreds and hundreds of publications, on this topic, especially related to the integration of language with visual cues during conversation. He also has a widely acclaimed book called The Continuity of Mind, which has been very fundamental in reshaping our understanding of how the brain operates in more of a continuous and fluid manner than in a more discrete representational manner. So we are thrilled to dive into his fascinating insights on how our mind functions on this episode of Beyond Phrenology. Spivey, welcome to Beyond Phrenology.
Thank you, Madhur. I'm pleased to be here. I've watched several of these podcasts and they look really fun. So I'm very happy to be part of it.
Thanks. So Spivey, I gave a little bit introduction, but no amount of introduction is, enough to summarize what you have done, especially the uniqueness of your contributions. So I invite you to, give a brief summary of, where, what was your inspiration, where exactly are you heading, and how it has been with your journey in cognitive sciences.
Yeah, my journey starts quite some time ago. In the late 1980s, early 90s, I was trained as a pretty much information processing framework cognitive psychologist. But pretty early, I was doing eye tracking in Bruce Bridgman's lab at UC Santa Cruz as an undergrad, and doing a senior thesis with Ray Gibbs there, looking at context effects in language processing. And so I was simultaneously interested in visual perception and psycholinguistics, which was an unusual combination when I went on the grad school market. Lots of people were confused about whether I wanted to do vision research for my PhD or whether I wanted to do psycholinguistics for my PhD. And I kept telling them I want to do both. And they said, no, which one do you want to do? I think it was that interest in looking at both of those that really led to what eventually became a change in my theoretical perspective as a result, in part due to a change in the methods that I was using. So when you're tracking people's eye movements while doing a purely reading task, I was doing a fair bit of experiments that way. You sit them down and they rest their head as motionless as possible. Sometimes you use a bite bar so their head doesn't move. And you get a very accurate track of their eye position while those eyes are reading sentences. And those are pretty ecologically invalid situations where a person's reading a sentence in a dark room and their head's not able to move. But you can get some very precise timing about what parts of the sentence make them read slowly or fast, and what kinds of context effects can change those confusion events or make them go away with the right kind of context. And so I was interested in context effects between syntax and semantics and between language and vision. And luckily, the right lab reached out and made an offer I couldn't refuse to work with Mike Tannenhouse at U of Rochester. And there, really what changed it was using eye tracking, not just for reading, but for spoken language comprehension, which was something that I don't think we would have come up with if I wasn't so interested in language and vision at the same time. Knowing what the eyes are going to do when you're hearing language doesn't make sense unless you think about a visual context with objects that you might look at. And that's how the visual world paradigm, as it gets called now, was born in the mid-90s with Mike Tannenhouse and me and our colleagues, Julie Sedevy, Kathy Eberhard, working in Dana Ballard's robotics lab, because that's where the eye tracker was. And when you start looking at a more temporally dynamic time series of motor behavior, rather than getting a reaction time from one stimulus trial and then another reaction time from another stimulus trial, if instead on an individual trial you can get some sort of multiple measurements like the saccade here and then a saccade there and then a saccade there, now within that one trial of, let's just say, giving someone a simple instruction like pick up the candle, and in addition to that real candle on the table, there's also a piece of candy, what we saw was that people's eyes would go for 300 milliseconds half the time to the candy and then a corrective eye movement to the candle. They reach out, pick up the candle. If you ask them afterwards, did you notice when I told you to pick up the candle, you looked at the candy? They would say, no, I didn't. Why would I do that? And so this was a pretty honest measure of a kind of temporally dynamic process over time that they're not even aware of. And their eye movements are the only way we could get any evidence. Asking them, we wouldn't know that they had looked at the wrong object. Getting reaction times, you might have gotten a slightly slower reaction time because of a distractor object in the display that sounds similar, like candy for candle. But it was only with eye movements that you're able to actually see that it's not just a slowdown because it took a while for that lexical representation in your dictionary of your mind to get active enough for you to recognize candle, and it was slower because candy was also there. You actually spent some time sending your sensory motor system oriented toward the wrong object. And you don't see that when you're doing reaction times. So this was a way to, I think, really, for me anyway, finally realize that what you need to do to understand cognition is, one, get a little more ecologically valid, put someone in a real situation with real objects, not on a bite bar reading sentences that got nothing to do with it, and a more ecologically valid situation and a more temporally dynamic, densely sampled measure, like eye movements. You make about 3 or 4 saccades per second. So that's a pretty good rate of data output for a system that's going to collect the kind of time series. Since then we've expanded to more ways, and there's lots of good ways to get good measures that are temporally dynamic and densely sampled over time. EEG is a beautiful example, and computer mouse movements we might talk about are another way. Tracking reaching movements, postural sway, all these things are what was happening in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, as we started to become aware of how the old-fashioned approach that information processing really pushed us toward, of having a stimulus that you do some cognitive mental activity for and then produce a response and measure that one individual response for that one individual stimulus, was misleading, I think. And it was a nice turn-based approach that the computer metaphor for the mind pushed us toward. Certainly lots of progress was made with those methodologies, but once I started looking at the time series of eye movements, that's when I kind of had the realization that I need a different theoretical apparatus than the computer metaphor for the mind if I want to talk about how a person goes through transitions in their mental state space for briefly thinking that object that looks like a candy might be relevant for my action. And they think about it so briefly that they're not even aware they thought about it, but it clearly drew the eye movements. And you need something more than a computer metaphor for the mind to account for that finding.
So how does this work? And and a lot of work you did, following this initiation, kind of counters the. So you talk about this in your 28 book on the continuity of mind, right? About representations. But one can always come back and say, yes, you're right, Spivey. It's not like representations we thought, but actually this dynamics itself is a representation. So it's like, I mean, representation, the beauty of representation is that you can always move the goalpost. And representations are still there. So how do you counter that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I'm not one of those people who firmly says that we should stop using the word representation in cognitive science because it's too misleading. I think there's sort of a grammatical distinction that is worthwhile. And if you treat the word representation as a count noun, meaning you can enumerate this representation and another representation and the third and a fourth representation, if those representations are treated as though they are countable, then you are clearly adhering to a computer metaphor for the mind, a kind of information processing approach that does rely on an old-fashioned approach of a stimulus is going to produce a representation, which is going to produce a response. And when you get ecologically valid measures that have some densely sampled temporal dynamics to them, it's easy to find that not only do you not actually just get an individual response in realistic environments like you and us talking smoothly and nodding as we see each other, gestures that become part of this continuous flow. It's not an individual response from any individual stimulus. And the inputs you're getting are not an individual stimulus at any point in time. Usually there's a pretty continuous flow from one seeming stimulus to the next seeming stimulus, and you can find lots of partial overlap among those seemingly different stimuli. And so if there aren't stimuli that are individuated and countable, and there aren't responses that are individuated and countable in most scenarios, maybe in a chess game you could do that, you could treat it that way, but in most naturalistic environments, you don't have that separability of this stimulus from the next one and that response from the next one. Then it's probably the case that the representations that are intervening between this stimulation and that behavior, those that representational capacity is probably not countable either. And it's made of a more continuous trajectory through a state space. This is what neural networks taught us all, is that when you have, a good, a recurrent neural network that's going to have some flowing activity across the system, you treat those nodes as dimensions in a state space. And then all of a sudden you'll have a state space in which the state of the system moves from this location to another location to another location. And that is the trajectory that, if the stimulation is continuous and the behavior is continuous, that trajectory is going to be pretty darn continuous. You can put labels on certain regions in that state space and pretend that getting to that location was that representation, and then moving to that location was that representation, and moving to that location was that representation. But that attempt to turn that continuous trajectory into a sequence of individuated representations is an idealization of the actual network behavior, because when you look at real biological networks, they don't produce a pattern of activity and stay there frozen for 100 or 300 milliseconds or whatever, and then jump to another location and stay there for a while. It's a pretty continuous flow with a fair bit of jitter in real biological networks and in good simulations of them. And so I'm comfortable with the term representation existing, but it should probably be a mass noun, essentially referring to the representational capacity of a network that produces a trajectory that has representation capabilities in it, qualities to it, but it's not a sequence of individuated representations. And most importantly, you really don't want to fall in the trap of treating those representations as if they were accessed and delivered to a central executive, because they walk right into the homunculus problem. And neural networks from the get-go are doing their best to try to avoid that. And good old-fashioned information processing approaches were sometimes unafraid of falling into that trap. And I think it's a trap we should all try to avoid. We don't want to be putting all the burden on a homunculus that then looks at the representations that are delivered to it.
Right. So, I mean, it's pretty loaded. So for instance, when you talk about so what you're trying to say is here, and for the audience, that the brain has a representational capacity when it comes to our real behavior. However, the mode of operation is not representational.
Yep.
Right. And that's how you do not have symbolic operations acting on representations the way, earlier cybernetics and information processing based theories try to pervade. Right. Okay.
I think those approaches got us a good distance. So, I don't think it was a waste of time to spend decades doing that. But I think it was kind of like charting. If there is a truly continuous trajectory, then they got us to find some landmarks that help us understand how that trajectory briefly visits this landmark and then the next landmark. And so it was worthwhile progress. But now I think understanding how you get from one representation like Attractor Basin to another representation like Attractor Basin, and then to the next one, how you get from one to the next is the next frontier of understanding what cognition does. Because those interstitial spaces in state space that don't easily have labels, like, when I say a sentence, I say one word and then the next word and then the next word, there's meaning that your brain is generating as a part of that process. And some of that meaning it's generating is in between those attractor basins that we put labels on. And that interstitial meaning space, I think, carries a whole lot of richness to it that we're missing out when we ignore it.
Yes. So here, we are very close to the idea of dimensions, for instance, right? So when you're talking about state spaces or, attractors or, these cliffs and, troughs, within those spaces, landscapes, We normally have these figures, like you yourself have these figures in several of your articles and the book. Basically, a two-dimensional or three-dimensional plane, right? Mostly a three-dimensional trajectory, because that's what we can represent, on pen and paper. And that's most what we can think of. When you talk to particle physicists or theoretical physicists, they often have derivations in 138 dimensions. And some of them can actually, or at least they claim, like I had a hard time myself to do it when I used to interact with my physicist colleagues, but they can imagine in many more dimensions than
No, they
we.
can't.
No, they
They
cannot.
can't. No, I don't know them, so I can't really say that. But my favorite claim or
Yeah,
sort of story from one physicist was that the way most of us think about high dimensional spaces is to
yeah,
imagine a three-dimensional space like a cube that we can imagine, and then just
right.
stare at it and say 20 dimensions, 20 dimensions, 20 dimensions.
Okay,
And so that's not really imagining; it's just pretending. But yeah,
okay,
I think you're absolutely right. Where you're going is that
yeah,
really high dimensional spaces are a different animal in a three-dimensional space, and the kinds of ways in which you can get proximity
yeah.
and nonlinearities actually changes quite a bit when it's a high-dimensional space.
Right. And it shoots exponentially, right? Like it's very hard to imagine, for instance, interspatial spaces in like 5 dimensions, like forget like 150 dimensions.
Yeah.
And we are talking about billions and millions of neurons, right? Even if you do like, age-old PCA, you can still have like 7 components, for instance, right? Even that is far higher dimensions than we normally can envision. So do you think that like even the space, I mean, it's a great development, but are we limited by our own capacity to think in 3D at most in what we will be able to understand about these spaces in the brain? So there will be something always hidden because
Mhm.
because we are limited by our senses and we are trying to understand a system which works uh, in in several magnitudes of more dimensions than we can represent it, mathematically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The one of my lessons that I teach students when I'm teaching them neural network simulations, that they build from scratch in MATLAB instead of using a point and click package. They write these things from scratch and they build these neural networks and they try to wrap their head around a multidimensional space that a network is inhabiting. And um, it's a playful story based on the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the lead character Richard Dreyfuss is like a handful of other people on the planet having channeled to his mind by the space aliens some image of a mountain, and he can't get it out of his head, and he keeps sketching it and drawing it obsessively. And then this two-dimensional thing that looks kind of like a hill or a tower, and other people are painting it as well, and everyone's trying to get this channeled image out of their heads on some kind of two-dimensional graph. And then finally, he gets obsessed enough that he builds a pile of mashed potatoes and then garden dirt and makes this three-dimensional sculpture. And that's where he discovers that in this image that's being channeled to him, there's a plateau in the back of the mountain that everyone else was missing when they were making two-dimensional images. And the plateau is the landing pad for the spaceship that comes. It's a playful version of the story, but
Yeah.
it's a way to think about how trying to get higher dimension representations of these systems is going to be more informative than the low dimension systems. And there'll be things that you miss, like you just pointed out, if you're having too low a dimensional analysis. So when you reduce some high dimensional neural network down to 3 dimensions in a PCA space and try to see where those clusters are, you see those clusters. And if you've got good software, you can rotate that 3D image and see how these things are close or far away from one another. And there will be probably some things you're missing because some of those patterns are existing in dimensions higher than the first, second, and third dimensions that you're able to envision. One way to get around that is just to trust the math and not rely so much on the visualizations. So, looking at, for example, Euclidean distance for objects in that state space, or for categories in that state space. Euclidean distance is going to be a less than helpful measure when you get really high dimensions. And so instead, people now know to use cosine distance. So you go from the origin of that state space and make a line to that location. And it doesn't matter how far that line had to go to get to that location. All you're looking at is between two objects that might be one here and one way over here.
Yeah.
If the cosine of the distance between them and the angle is a large amount or a small amount, that's going to tell you more about how similar
Yes.
these things are treated in that high dimensional state space. So that's one
Yeah.
way in which you don't have to reduce the dimensionality to know how close, how related things are in a state space that might be so big and high dimensional that it's hard to envision.
Right. That's interesting. It comes back, makes me think about Plato's cave, right? It feels like we are still, no matter what we do, we are still looking at the shadows.
That's pretty much what PCA is doing.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you talk about probabilistic, arguments. For instance, the whole experiment of candies and versus candle, right? Where you have the scan, which is common to both in the linguistic space, and that's why it's kind of a distractor. And had it not been a candy, it had been probably like a pen. It would have been less a distractor, right? Because the
Exactly.
lexicon
That's what the data
is
show. Yeah.
right is contributing to that. But that a simple an explanation is how, for instance, like large language models work, right?
Yep.
So where are we differentiating, or where is the whole idea of these trajectories able to differentiate brain from large language models, or are we implying more similarity than we acknowledged in earlier linguistic times?
Well, yeah, there's been decades of arm wrestling over who's going to build the right kind of chatbot, traditional symbolic AI approaches or neural network approaches. And the neural network approaches, in the 1980s, once neural networks were allowed to come out from under the rug that they were hiding during the 70s, those neural network approaches were touting the fact that they are a little bit closer to what a brain really does, only a little bit, but a little bit closer. Those connectionist models had simulated neurons with simulated synapses.
Yeah.
And the symbolic AI approaches in those days were still pretty far ahead of what the neural networks could do. And so within computer science and AI, they were like, we're not interested in these cute little models. Those are nice ways to talk about how a human mind might work, but we're trying to build artificial intelligence that doesn't need necessarily to follow what a human brain or a human mind does. And then give them a few more decades, and
Yeah.
they kind of plateaued in those symbolic AI approaches, in my humble opinion. And that plateau was then exceeded by these things like large language models that are based on the same kind of backpropagation learning algorithm that was developed in the 80s. The deep learning approaches are doing things that are a little bit brain-like, and with a whole lot more neurons and a whole lot more synapses. Now we have a chatbot that can do a way better conversation with a human, way more convincing and compelling than any of those symbolic AI approaches were able to do. So I think, a colleague of mine, Mike Moser, who was an academic for a long time, and early he was part of the PDP, Parallel Distributed Processing Group of connectionists in the 80s. And he was a faculty member at Colorado University Boulder for a long time. And now he's working at Google. And I was chatting with him just last summer, where he said to me, in reference to the ChatGPT and LLM models being so successful, he said, yeah, it's fun to play the I told you so game.
Right.
And hearing that from a Google person, it was kind of nice to see that an AI place that had, a long history of the past of not necessarily embracing neural networks, symbolic AI approach, symbolic AI researchers from decades and decades ago now are realizing that I told you so.
Right. And so where does is still, the old connectionist framework is still applicable? Like, is it going to fade away, or are there spaces where that's more relevant, and probably, if alive, it might actually have, fruitful returns?
Well, yeah, I think there's still a whole lot of people have steered away from using the word connectionist lately,
Yeah.
and instead they're using referring to them as neural network simulations. Even though if you look at them, you go, oh, that's a good old-fashioned connectionist model, but they didn't want to, for a long time, I think my colleagues and I didn't want to use connectionist, the word connectionist, especially colleagues of mine who were doing neural networks. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think I knew a lot of colleagues who were still symbolic AI, symbolic cognition folks who would flippantly say, yeah, so connection was a fad and it faded already, and now we're back to doing things the way we're supposed to do it. And I was always kind of stunned when they would say that to me. It was in part due to the conference of the Cognitive Science Society was definitely kind of overwhelmed by connectionist approaches in the 90s. And there was a concerted effort to try to not let this conference turn into a connectionist dominated community. And that concerted effort led to a more balancing out of the kinds of frameworks that were being presented in terms of being admitted submissions that were accepted. And so that concerted effort to prevent it from becoming a top-down effort to prevent it from becoming a connectionist dominated venue played a role in people's perception that this fad was now fading. And that's why I really take some pleasure in hearing the phrase "I told you so." Because, that it was a rumor that there was the stories of connectionism's death were greatly exaggerated, and so now in AI they're using very large neural network models that are in some cases so darn large that they're almost as opaque as the black box of the brain. And so now we have something that is pretty human-like in how it uses language, and it's also pretty human-like in how opaque its internal processes are. So there's a little bit of a weakness in the scientific goal of figuring out how a human mind does language. Now that we have a neural network model that also does language pretty similarly in its behavior, but it's also really hard to figure out what it's doing too. And so I think there's still a really important space for smaller scale connectionist neural network models that are doing something almost as impressive as an LLM, and much more easier to peek inside and see what kinds of clusters in its state space it's producing, what kind of trajectories it's having as it travels through that state space to do language-like tasks or vision-like tasks. It's got some interesting temporal dynamics to it.
So I mean, forgive me, it might be a very naive question. So just like brain, so when we're talking about neural networks and large language models, are we talking about the whole brain, or are we talking about or equating them to the language area in the brain? So my question following is, can we create lesions in artificial neural networks or LLMs, which create similar kind of deficits in language?
Excellent question.
Or have people been doing such kind of stuff in the virtual space?
So I don't actually know of people doing that with an LLM, but 20 years ago, people were doing that with some of the connectionist models. And since then, we have learned that there isn't a language area of the brain. There's a network of areas that cooperate to do language, and that network of areas is not all right next to each other. There are some spread out regions, and so that network has some partial biases toward this component of the network does mostly semantics, and this other component does mostly phonetics, but they're not modules that do only those things. There's a little more prominence in how the data shows being roughly specialized for those sub areas within language. And so 20 years ago, when they were building these connectionist network simulations of small language tasks, they were testing some of these double dissociation methods that you find with neuropsychology. You get someone who has one kind of brain lesion and another person with a different kind of brain lesion, and then it turns out that the one person has one aspect of language that seems to be broken, the other person has a different, seemingly non-overlapping aspect of language that seems to be broken for them. And those double dissociations in neuropsychology were used as evidence that clearly you have a semantics part of your brain and a syntax part of your brain, for example. And then these connectionist simulations tried exactly what you're talking about, was to introduce some lesions inside a network that is actually a fully connected network that doesn't have subcomponents for one aspect of language like semantics and a subcomponent for a different aspect like syntax. With some simulated damage in this area or this portion of a hidden layer or that portion of a hidden layer, you can actually get double dissociation behavior out of a neural network that did not have separated modules in it. And this was work by Nick Chater and colleagues from 25 years ago. Really important stuff. Guy Van Orden did some of that work, basically showing that you shouldn't interpret a double dissociation neuropsychology effect as compelling evidence that there were modules that make that ability capable, and one person has that module destroyed, and has the other module destroyed. You can get that kind of double dissociation out of a network that doesn't have subcomponent modules.
That's very interesting insight. Goes with the theme beyond phrenology. With the brain map behind me. It's very, very interesting. So you talk a lot about interaction dominant dynamics, right? Like, so I see, your earlier work then kind of morphing and getting more closer to ecological psychology, as a field, right? I'm not sure whether you were initially inspired by the ecological psychology approach, or it was the dynamical systems framework, which ecological psychology people also adapted, which brought you more closer to that community. So could you elaborate a little more on that and how interaction dominant dynamics come into the picture in your work?
Excellent question. Yeah, so it's sort of these three components that are mixing of me looking at more ecologically valid kinds of tasks, instead of a word on a screen that you press a button to, having more something like sentences that are naturally delivered, maybe by a live speaker, and then having pretty natural behaviors of moving objects around on a table. Sort of get that participant to go on autopilot, and you get pretty natural behaviors. And then the key next step is to have a continuous measure of their behavior. There was certainly in the 1980s really good psycholinguistics work with naturalistic conversation scenarios that Herb Clark and colleagues were doing. But they wouldn't have continuous measures of behavior. They would just have like a video recording of that. And then you have some offline analyses to try to figure out what happened at this part of the conversation versus that part. Finally, getting ecologically valid scenarios combined with a densely sampled measure of continuous behavior, like eye movements and reaching movements. That, I think, for me, was a big change, and it made me switch from an information processing approach to a dynamical systems approach. That recognition that once you have an ecologically valid scenario that has continuous stimulation from the environment and continuous behavior out to the environment, instead of a stimulus followed by a response, and then another trial of a stimulus followed by a response. That continuity of flow, for me, is what led me to ecological psychology, because, of course, that was one of the key insights that Jimmy Gibson had way back when, in the 1950s and 60s, was that there are no stimuli.
Yeah.
There is stimulation. And after grad school and sort of beginning this transition during grad school, then I got my first job at Cornell University in their psychology department, which is where Jimmy Gibson was for so many years. He was passed away when I got there. His wife, Jackie Gibson, was still there, so I got to meet with her a few times. That was really informative and exciting. But it definitely felt also that Jimmy Gibson's ghost walks the halls of the psychology department there.
You thank it in your book, right?
Yes, whispering insights into your ear. Not literally a ghost, but there's this sort of his influence is there among all the psychologists there, the social psychologists, the biological psychologists, and of course the cognitive perceptual psychologists, all had enough of exposure to that framework to realize that, there's important insights to be gathered there. And that's where I sort of absorbed that knowledge as well. And of course, visiting University of Connecticut, where the late, great Michael Turvey would hold court at his pub in the basement. I would go there a few times for workshops, several times, and he would tell stories and provide deep insights that were very compelling to me and helped complete my transition from a cognitive psychologist to an ecological dynamical psychologist or cognitive scientist.
Right. So is this kind of work limited to the methods you just mentioned? Because right now, almost all our instrumentation or measuring capabilities is high density. not just temporal density, but also spatial density. For example, most of the imaging provides the kind of signals which are very, amenable to this kind of framework.
Yep.
However, the traditional or the dominant neuropsychological framework is still representational and still, following the old information theoretical perspective, right? No matter what institution we are talking about, and no matter, even when you're talking about at the level of grants and like expenditure.
Yep.
So why do you think that's the case? And we are seeing the repercussions in terms of, like, for instance, the brain project funding this year is like so much less than it used to be because neuroscience did not live up to the promises, which it did like decades back, where we had billions of dollars of investment. So why do you think that's the case, and where exactly would it come back to the dynamical systems, at some point as a dominant?
Well, there is a bit of a neuroscience industrial complex
Yeah.
that has had to maintain itself because millions and millions of dollars are invested into this brain scanning lab and that one, and then it takes millions of dollars to maintain those labs. And so,
Yeah.
NIH is going to be inundated with grant proposals that request of funding to keep those things going. And I'm a big supporter of that work. I do think that fMRI is not as powerful as we once thought for the kinds of things we now need to study. And that's because it's has to average over a whole second approximately to get a good image. It's amazing with its spatial precision, its spatial resolution, but averaging over a second for anything that's a continuous flow of stimulus and behavior
Yes.
is too large a chunk of time to average over. And of course, there's a hemoglobin delay of when the blood actually gets there. So you're looking at a second or two of delay and a second of averaging over time to get that really good high.
And you are assuming equal delay for every process, when every process can be at different time scale.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, different parts of the brain have different rates at which the blood will get there too. And so there's a fMRI, I think, was fantastic 10 and 20 years ago at making really important advances. And now I think MEG is what we should be investing in now for something that is going to be almost as high spatial resolution, certainly better than EEG for spatial resolution, and as fast as EEG to pick up on precise timings of changes in that stimulation flow and cognitive flow and behavioral flow. So yeah, MEG and still EEG, of course, for more affordable labs. MEG and EEG, I think, are still really important for what we're trying to do. And you're right that a lot of the neuroscientists using these, or cognitive neuroscientists using these methods, have still been operating in a kind of representationalist fashion. And fMRI certainly sort of leads you there because you're finding a static averaged period of time during which you want to find a 10 brain state that was averaged over a second. So it's not really a brain state, but you pretend that lit up image is a brain state and try to map it onto some mental state. And I think now we're at a stage where we should know that that's not really the right way to think about these things. And as you have more temporally dynamic things like MEG and EEG, you're going to realize that those states are changing so fast that you don't want to treat them that way. Looking at the power spectrum in EEG, I think, is really informative. And so instead of pretending that there are stages in time where you can find some ERP for this and ERP for that, that
more
was
continuous.
That was a similar kind of representationalist assumption approach. And now that looking at the power spectrum with energy happening at alpha wave stage or beta or else other kinds of wavelengths ranges is going to be, I think, more informative. And instead of pretending that there are specific points in time where an ERP said this machine became operable in the brain, and then the next machine became operable, they're not machines. And so I think where I see the most exciting advances in brain scanning these days is with hyperscanning. And hyperscanning refers to when you have multiple people in multiple scanners, or either EEG or MEG, and they're doing some kind of joint cooperative task. Maybe it's a conversation for a psycholinguistic experiment. maybe it's some other kind of cooperative task.
Yeah.
You're looking at how those two brains get coordinated over time. That's some of the most exciting stuff that is, I think, going to pretty clearly lead those
Yes.
researchers to unavoidably drift away from an information processing approach and
Yes.
representationalist approach and have to open up their mind to something
Yeah.
different.
I mean, to reveal the secret, I mean, we are trying ourselves, when we talk about muscle synergies, neuromuscular control, we always talk about the same body, right? We are trying to do the same thing in joint coordination task where we want to see whether one brain can actually coordinate with the neural space or like muscular space of the second person, And this is what we do during conversations as well. I mean, even when it's like not a physically jointed space, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Where do FNIRs come into,
Oh
like
yeah,
where do
I
you see the
left that
space?
out. I think fNIRS is fantastic too, and it's been getting better. I remember
Yeah.
10 and 15 years ago, or yeah, 15 years ago, people talking about how the current fNIRS technology was particularly good with babies because their skulls are
Yeah.
thinner. And I think the technology has improved enough that it's also very informative now with adult thickness skulls. And so yeah, I would put fNIRS right next to MEG and
Okay.
as good temporal.
And then it's more affordable as well
Exactly.
and easy to implement. Yeah. Okay. So that brings me to one more thing like regarding this. So, initially I had an impression that doesn't matter that, if for instance, we are so much dominant about, fMRI or, instruments which lead us to more representational kind of ideas. And if we just publish open data sets, right? If we just keep the data open, at any point in time, we can come back and we can analyze the same data and kind of, revise our interpretations. It turns out that's not the case because your experimental designs themselves are heavily dominated by how you think about the brain, right? So you are destined to find outcomes, so would you talk a little more about how our ideas of science are constrained, how our experimental designs are constrained, and it starts with a get-go in terms of, our baggage with our assumptions.
Yep. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's was my own experience. In grad school, for example, was I had a information processing approach that I'd been taught, a kind of computer metaphor for the mind, and so I was very comfortable with experiments that had a stimulus followed by a response, and those seemed really informative. And then I started tracking people's eye movements in more naturalistic tasks and realized, wow, that way of thinking isn't going to work for this. And so I think that's gradually happening in a lot of scenarios, like hyperscanning. I think is where it will start to happen. It's a prediction, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I think the kinds of methods you use unavoidably will constrain the kinds of theories you could develop, right? And it works the other way around. The kinds of theories you have that you start with are going to help you choose particular methods that seem best fitted to that way of thinking, and then you're going to train people with those methods, and those people trained with those methods are going to like your theory.
Right.
Funny how that works. And it's commonly said that science moves forward one funeral after another with somebody with a theoretical framework passes away, and so that theoretical framework dies. Problem is, that person had grad students that they trained their methods to and their theories with, and that grad student, reinforced their own trust in those methods and theory because they match so well, and then they train their students, and so it doesn't always advance one funeral at a time. Sometimes those grad students are sticking close to the original training of their advisors.
So we can revise it to one funeral attendees at a time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's very interesting. I mean, and that kind of creates the drift, which we see, obsolete paradigms, still sustaining and kind of taking the resources, making basically the economic enterprise more inefficient.
Yep.
So coming back to interaction dominant dynamics. So you talk a lot about interaction dominant dynamics, right? So what kind of interactions are we talking about there, and like how does this connect to both how you design experiments and how you analyze, or what kind of frameworks? For instance, we talk about F1 by F noise for in EcoPsych and Dynamical Systems framework. So how does interaction dominant lead to 1 by F noise, and then how does it relate to power spectrum? Because you said like when we go to MEG, we should look at this power spectrum and not just at certain peaks.
Yeah. So with interaction dominant dynamics, this is something that was especially put forward by Guy Van Orden along with Chris Kello, and Chris Kello has been on this podcast. That work, I think, was really compelling to me because it basically said there's a statistical signature of 1/f noise such that the noise is not white across time. It has correlations across time. And the kinds of systems that produce that are interaction dominant systems, not component dominant dynamics systems. So a component dominant dynamic systems, that kind of system is where most of the work is being done by the components. That would be, a Jerry Fodor style module-based account of cognition, where you have a module for word recognition, or a module for sentence processing, or the grammar, another module for memory, another module for various other things. And these modules are doing the work, and they have all inside their cells specific domain-specific kinds of rules to follow their computations. And then their output is very limited and unidirectional. The lexical module sends input to the syntactic module and doesn't go backwards because there's no need for that.
And earlier experimentation, if I'm correct, like were designed to find time intervals which each and every process takes, right? So finally, you will design experiments to identify, oh, this module takes like these many milliseconds within this whole process.
Yeah, so that was the additive method by Sternberg in the 60s, and that Donders did it in the 1800s as a way of just looking at if the average reaction time is a little bit longer for this slightly more complex task, then the added complexity for that task is probably due to an additional box in that box and arrow model. That box and arrow model was, dominating cognitive psychology for so long. And it clearly does, it's a component dominant dynamics framework in which the vast majority of the cognitive work being done is inside each of those individual modules. And the interactions, those feed forward arrows, do little work. They just kind of transmit a message from the output of one of these modules to become the input for the next module. And so it's pretty minimal in the interactions. That kind of system, when it produces variance over in data, it can only produce white noise variance, right?
Yeah, Gaussian variance, yes.
And so when you find scale invariant variance, so you get fine noise that's 1/f in its structure for reaction time tasks over time, like Guy Van Orden did, David Gilden, Chris Kello. It's an indication, it's a statistical signature telling you that the system we're measuring probably is not component dominant in its dynamics because it would have white noise otherwise. And so that presence of that statistical signature suggests that you have interaction dominant dynamics. And the way to think about interaction dominant dynamics is essentially the inverse of those component dominant dynamics. Is you might have some component-like system that's doing something of your lexical processing and another component-like system that's doing something of your syntactic processing. But the interactions between those systems is actually doing more of the work for figuring out how to understand a sentence that's made up of word after word after word after word. The interactions, how a lexical type process is telling syntax a continuous flow of its updates of what word we might be hearing at this moment. And then syntax is sending feedback right back to that lexical system saying, based on the syntactic context, we should be expecting these kinds of words coming next. So adjust your internal computations. If that interaction feedback flow that is sort of blending syntactic and lexical information is doing most of the work and showing context effects for lexical and syntactic information, like we have done for decades now, finally, showing those context effects is one indication that these things are not separate modules and components that are independent of one another. And then that statistical signature of 1/f noise in the time series of word tasks also tells you that it's not a component dominant dynamic system, it is interaction dynamics. So essentially, if that syntactic process is taking into account lexical updates in real time and giving syntactic guidance in real time to that lexical process, and it's doing the same thing to the syntactic box, then most of the work's being done by that feedback loop, not by the modules.
Right.
So that's the interaction that is dominating the cognitive process. The interactions are doing more work than the components are. And so it suggests that that syntactic module actually knows a whole lot of lexical information.
Mm-hmm.
And that lexical module knows a whole lot of syntactic knowledge as
Yeah.
well. And so they're not as informationally encapsulated. They're not as domain specific in the kinds of computations they perform. They might not even be well described as things that should have lines of borders
Right, right.
around this box and that box. Maybe if the arrows are doing most of the work, we should focus on what those arrows are like. And once you change that box and arrow model into a whole bunch of arrows instead,
It becomes a flow.
it becomes a flow. It looks very different. It has a cascaded flow, to borrow a
Yeah.
term from Jay McClellan in 1979. That cascaded flow is going to produce a 1RF noise. It's going to produce massive context effects all over the place, especially when you get that system in a ecologically valid scenario where the stimulation is flowing. It's not delivered as individual stimuli.
Yeah.
That system that has its own internal flow is going to be best measured when it's receiving internal flow and external output as a flow.
But that comes with a lot of challenge when it comes to how we analyze the data, because we are talking about now a continuous space with a continuous moving, like you have like kind of cartoons of those in your book where you're talking about like different arrows. So we are suddenly talking about like fluid dynamics here, because the whole statistical physics and field of fluid dynamics uses those kind of flow models. So that needs a very different kind of analytical training set than traditional, linear models, or, where we just stack upon one more covariate in our analysis, to figure out the additive contribution of that particular system.
Yeah, it's a daunting thing to sort of request of a grad student who's been trained in more traditional representationalist methods to say, you need to learn about flow dynamics. And here's some gigantic dynamical equations that if you don't wrap your head around these, then you're not going to be able to do this work. I think baby steps are the solution. And it is still the case that a lot of undergrads who get interested in grad school in cognitive science, those undergrads, it could be that the majority, I think it's a thin majority if it is, but the majority of them are still being trained in a more traditional representationalist information processing approach. So when they get to a grad program that wants to have them think more dynamically, you've got some splaining to do, you've got some transformation to do for that person, and baby steps are the way to do it. So they might not get to heavy duty flow dynamics equations until maybe their dissertation, if that's where they're going. But even just getting them to start understanding that simple equations that have a feedback loop, like the logistic map is an insanely simple equation, but if its output becomes the next input, which becomes the next output, which becomes that tiny simple equation for the logistic map does amazing things. It demonstrates chaos, it demonstrates periodic behavior, it demonstrates stable attractor basin, point attractor behavior, all just by adjusting one parameter inside it. And that's an insanely simple equation that it isn't scary, isn't hard to handle. And having first and second year grad students experiment with these kinds of simple dynamical models like a logistic map, like a Lorenz attractor, maybe play around with Conway's game of life, I think is a good way to get a grad student who needs to do some mental transformation to handle dynamics to not just see a description of the logistic map, but actually write a few lines of code, because it's only a few lines, and play around with that thing and see it on their own, look inside it and play with it, adjust the parameters to their own experimentation. I think that kind of learning experience is a baby step, but it's a powerful baby step to pull someone away from thinking in terms of old-fashioned representationalist approaches, seeing that a feedback loop for almost anything makes it so much more powerful than a feed forward stage-based sequence of processes that pretty quickly walk into a homunculus problem anyway.
I'm kind of thinking at the meta level here. So we need, like you said, you use the word transformation, right? transforming a graduate student. It's more like, it's also very similar to like religious transformations, from theist to atheist versus very different religions. Sometimes it happens at an instance, right? So you show the cube, right? The 3D cube in your book, where we can think of, initially it's very hard to figure out whether the cube is from the top or from the bottom. People are biased towards one. And you can train yourself to kind of flip between the two with a particular frequency, right? And it becomes easier and easier once you're able to see the other one, right? And you have explanations from the dynamical systems framework about this thing. Now there are times when you cannot have the transformation. It's like you're banging your head against a wall. It can be a graduate student, it can be religious fundamentalism, or it can be, for instance, in these figures where it's very hard for some people or for yourself under certain situations to flip the image and see the other side, right?
Yeah.
So what is the dynamical system explanation for that? Which is not like that it's so high a peak that, is there any other explanation than it's such a higher peak that it's like a very low energy landscape, so we are not able to cross that, peak? Is there any more to that?
So what's the dynamical systems explanation of being trapped in one attractor
yeah,
basin?
stuck in a attractor basin, yeah.
So I think there's a lot of really cool experiments in problem solving literature that touch on that kind of idea. Insight problems are types of problems where you do get this aha effect, and people, when they find the solution, they will say aha.
Yeah,
it's a technical term, the aha effect, where they really do feel like they're banging their head against the wall. They're stuck in some attractor basin for suboptimal ways to solve this problem. And there's a number of ways to get out of that. A dynamical systems account would be finding a way to make that really deep attractor basin that you're stuck in relax a bit, to flatten out a little bit. And so flattening the landscape is a term that's now being used for a lot of dynamical systems treatments of problem solving and even memory access. If you get stuck in some attractor basin and you're trying to, I've certainly had this experience trying to remember the name of a particular celebrity or actor, and that name gets on the tip of your tongue and you can't quite get it. It's because you're stuck in some attractor basin where you might be coming up with the wrong name, and it's the wrong name, and you're trying to get to somewhere else, but you're trying to remember that person's name, and you're coming up with someone else's name that might be similar, and you're stuck on it, and that attractor basin just won't let go. And then we all probably have had this experience where then you give up, or maybe you look it up on Google and hunt it down via movies they've been in or whatever. But if you give up and then walk away and do something else for a while,
it comes
actually allows that attractor landscape to relax a bit, to flatten a bit. And then you ask yourself the question, who was that actor I was thinking of? And the name pops out easily.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing, there are experiments that people do exactly that, of having someone encounter that impasse where they're stuck, unable to get to the solution of some kind of problem, and then just do an experimental manipulation where they pull away from that task and do something else and then go back to it. And sure enough, that frequently helps them solve the problem. And flattening the landscape is one way people talk about that, letting go of your really strong assumptions, or your maybe even an implicit, your brain's sticking you into some area that you might think in as assumption, or you might know is the wrong thing, and you just can't let go of it anyway. Addiction is like that, or being stuck on the wrong name is like that.
Right.
And so there's a lot of ways to flatten the landscape. One is to try to stop thinking about that thing for a while. Another is meditation techniques. And even some people have been experimenting with treating psychedelics as a way to flatten the landscape, to release the strength with which you are committed to certain assumptions.
No, it's very insightful, because, when you talk about, what is the, like, let's say we are talking about the NIH and the medical implications of, the dynamical systems framework, it completely opens a whole new set of ways of thinking, even from the rehab treatment side or the implication side, about the things which, we have been trying to address for a long time, using traditional approaches with little success. Addiction being one example.
Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah.
No, go ahead. No,
go ahead.
Well, so I might be shifting us toward embodiment earlier than you want to go, but that's one place where I think a lot of the applications and treatments.
Even I was transitioning to embodiment. We're talking about, like, asking you about more about multimodal, ways of thinking about the brain and embodiment. So also for the viewers, Spivey is writing a book chapter in our upcoming book on embodied cognition. So, and it's a fascinating chapter. I mean, I've already edited it. So would you talk a little more about embodied cognition,
Yeah.
and where this transitions all this? And probably this is the only way to go into embodied cognition, because representation doesn't allow us to go into embodied cognition at all.
Mhm. That's a yeah. Representation doesn't allow us to go into embodied cognition. That I think I think that is a common impression from a lot of researchers, both in the embodiment camp and not in the embodiment camp, and that impression may have led to uh, how much opposition there is among representationalist theorists against embodiment. And I don't know that it's a correct assumption that you have to give up on representationalism completely in order to embrace embodiment. And here's how the story would go. It actually draws on um, some some theoretical treatment of consciousness and interactionism in neural network-like systems that Susan Hurley, philosopher, wrote about in 1998 in the same special issue that has Clark and Chalmers' famous Extended Mind article. Susan Hurley's article is at least as important there. And her argument goes as follows. If you're thinking of representational vehicles, which is a technical term in philosophy for something a little bit like a container of meaning.
Mhm.
And you're thinking that the mind uses representational vehicles in a brain system that is connectionist-like or neural networky-like enough that it might have interaction dominant dynamics. She doesn't use that term. But if the interactions, if the connections between these representational vehicles are doing more of the work than the vehicles themselves,
Yeah.
then that interactionism among those representational vehicles, if it's doing more of the work than the vehicles themselves, then it's not hard to recognize the fact that those vehicles also have connections with things other than just themselves. Those vehicles, those representational vehicles, have direct connections to the sensors of your body and to the effectors of your body. So your limbs and your eyes and your ears and your mouth as a speech apparatus for output, all that stuff has direct connections and direct interactionism with those representational vehicles in your mind. So if you're paying attention to the connections more so than the actual components, then those interactions are spreading out to the body immediately, obviously having direct connections with those. And then that body has direct connections with things in the environment. When you grasp an object and manipulate it, that object is pressing back on your finger pads, providing immediate sensory feedback as a result of the force I'm applying to that object. And so that feedback loop is producing connections between the representational vehicles and your sensors and effectors and the things out in the world. Susan Hurley said that basically, if you embrace a kind of interactionism that connectionist models were parallel distributed processing models were proposing, there's nothing in principle that stops the spread. That was the phrasing she used. The spread of that interactionism happening not just between brain regions, but between brain regions and sensors and effectors and things out in the world. And so if those interactions are what's really generating your cognition, then you can't help but at least be ready for a spread to those cognitive activities being generated by your actual motor movements and your actual physical interactions with other things in the environment. And getting back to hyperscanning, some of those things in the environment are other people that you're interacting with. Their speech apparatus is going into their ears and vice versa. And our eyes are seeing each other's gestures. And that communication process is making each other part of the connections that are generating cognition, where, when you have a good conversation with somebody, a big part of that cognitive activity is happening in between those two agents.
Yeah.
Because of that interactionism.
Right.
So in principle, nothing stops the spread.
Okay. In principle, theoretically, yes, but yeah, you're right. You're right. I mean, there's no. It's hard to refute. Yeah.
I mean,
So
it's certainly the case that, if you did a multiple regression analysis somehow that was able to figure out
yeah,
how much variance in this part of my brain is accounted for by another part of my brain, that's going to be a high number of good
yeah,
correlation. And then the correlation between this part of my brain and that part of that same analogous part of your brain is going to be a lower correlation rate, but it's
yeah,
statistically greater than chance. And so that spread is not at the same level everywhere. It has a drop off, of course,
yeah,
but it's non-zero in a lot of situations. And so that's where embodiment of cognition tells you that representationalism is not necessarily wrong,
yeah,
but it spreads outside of the brain, outside of the body even. And so you can talk about maybe not individuated representations that are being transferred from me to you and you to me. That sender-receiver communication theory from the 1950s.
like packets of information.
Packets of information. That was a nice start, but it's clearly a flow where if we're occasionally completing each other's sentences or interrupting in a cooperative fashion that makes the idea more complex and accurate, those interruptions that clearly are not a turn taking of sender and receiver. It's a flow of continuous output from my mouth, continuous input to your ears, continuous output from your mouth. It interrupts me at times, and I interrupt you at times. And we make these conversations where the conversation is not well described as a turn taking of information packets.
Maybe future chat GTPs will be, or language models would be more. I don't think they can handle interruptions right now, but maybe in the future.
I think when they get a little less turn taking, they'll be able to probably be better conversationalists, and they're the best ones of AI now so far, but they could be better for sure.
Okay. So now, like, why do we need to think of embodiment? I mean, the neuroscience enterprise can continue without going into embodiment, right? Like, what's the need? Is it just a elaboration, like increasing the scope, or is it fundamentally changing, how we look at the brain?
I think it fundamentally changes how we look at the brain, in part because exactly what J.J. Gibson was pushing for in the 1960s and 70s was an ecological validity. And it is hard to get an ecologically valid scenario when someone's sitting in a brain scanner. But you can make steps in that direction. And EEG and fNIRS makes it a little easier too. You don't have to be supine inside a machine that's making noise. And so as you get to more ecologically valid situations, this has, I think, had that gradual drift toward things like hyperscanning, where people realize we're seeing something different when we let a person have an ecologically valid joint coordination of a cognitive activity with another person. What we're seeing in the brain signals is different than what we used to see when we were doing ERPs for a word presented on the screen, followed by another word presented on the screen, followed by another word. There's different ways to talk about what that brain is doing now that we have more ecologically valid situations and more densely sampled measures like EEG and fNIRS and MEG for those scenarios. So the embodiment is that intermediate stage from going to focusing solely on the brain to recognizing that the body is playing an important role. And the further next of that spread, example of that spread, is to the extendedness or embeddedness of that organism with an environment that might contain another organism. And now all of a sudden the cognitive activity is a constant, continuous flow between this organism and that organism. And it's via the embodiment. I mean, the way my mouth works requires some understanding of the embodiment of it. So when I'm talking, my mouth does a certain set of things, and yours does a certain set of things. And that plays a role, that embodiment of my speech apparatus and yours plays a role in how we talk. Everything from gestures as well. All kinds of things are playing important roles in the way we communicate. That if you ignored it, maybe make the situation so ecologically invalid that you don't get to see the person, you don't get to see gestures. Maybe you don't even hear a person's way of talking or accent. Maybe it's a text. Text communication is so ecologically invalid compared to normal situations of communication.
Most breakups happen at text. Yeah,
exactly. That's no wonder, because you're missing so much of the important embodied information.
So okay. So I mean, this is also, out of my own, like, I'm like a second year assistant professor, like trying to fund my research program. So when we talk about embodiment, so like you, for instance, several people, the whole ecological psychology community for the most part, and a lot of dynamical systems framework had been traditionally funded by the NSF, right? Uh, which funds mostly like the basic research. And then you have a larger pool of, resources, the NIH, but it is more health related. So
Mhm.
now someone who wants to stick to the dynamical principles, but also want to navigate the healthcare landscape and more biomedical landscape, we need to, and also to sustain the research program, right? We have to think more in terms of, the implications. But at the same time, our implications also are framed by the cognitivist model, where when we think of the disease, we think about health versus disease, as if there's a sudden one day shift from representation of the health to the representation of disease, right? We don't talk about disease trajectories, for instance.
Yeah.
And people can have different disease trajectories and different trajectories to the same disease across different times through different ways. And it's also a very dynamical process. So clearly, dynamical systems might give us newer insights about disease and think about bringing back, changing the state, for instance, of the individual towards non-diseased health. And that's why this framework is, I think, some psychiatrists and psychologists are finding more value in dynamical systems, landscape. So what's your recommendation? Like, how do we think in terms of the biomedical, and how the bringing in embodiment kind of helps us to think more biomedical and more in terms of the implications?
So yeah, I do feel like the medical profession has a long history of essentially having thresholds along some set of
Yeah,
parameter measure, blood tests or whatever measure you might take. Once it hits that threshold, then you say, okay, now we can apply this diagnosis and prescribe this medication or perform this
yeah,
procedure or whatever. And until that point, if we haven't reached that threshold, then there's nothing to do, and we
mm,
shouldn't worry about it. And that's wrong. It's pretty
yeah,
simple. The trajectory toward reaching that threshold that you might cross in the future is something that can be treated early. And that's what preventative treatment is. And that's the
yeah,
key thing that a lot of people have pointed out, even without having to discuss the technical details of dynamical systems. A lot of people have pointed out that our medical profession needs to focus more on preventative methods. And so, um, just like work that a lot of people have done with time series analysis in problem solving tasks. So,
mm,
uh, your colleague Damien Kelty-Steven has beautiful work that he did years ago showing that before someone has that aha moment, that sudden
yeah,
transition from one mental state to the next of figuring out how to solve a problem, a few a few trials before that, you can see a jump in entropy in the time
yeah,
series analysis of their eye movement patterns, maybe their pointing patterns for this display. And that's a sort of concrete example of getting an early measure that something's about to change significantly. In this case, it's a good thing changing, where you find a new insight for solving the
yeah,
problem. But it's a way to predict upcoming change if you're doing the densely sampled time series analysis. And the same, I think, applies to cognitive or sort of medical situations. It could be cognitive or other biological medical situations where the medical profession sets this threshold, and if you don't cross it, then we're not going to worry about it.
yeah,
If you see a trajectory that's going that direction, then do some preventive interventions, and so they don't have to get to a threshold where they get a full-fledged diagnosis and have to take some medicine. The pharmaceutical companies love it when you have to take the medicine, so maybe they're okay with us waiting until you cross that threshold. But the medical profession itself would be more successful at its goal if it could use things like dynamical systems mindsets to be able to get predictions of upcoming transitions that
yeah.
you can prevent from ever happening in the first place.
Okay. And is there any work you're aware of in this domain? I think this definitely in terms of, the times, there's a lot of scope in terms of time series analysis and,
Uh,
prediction, but in terms of like understanding the physiology as well.
I don't know if medical work is focused specifically on that kind of being able to
Okay.
predict stuff. It is the case, I think, that good doctors will
Yeah,
notice that if your blood pressure has been going up, but it's not quite at the level it counts as hypertension, but it's been
yeah,
going up, those good doctors will tell you,
Yeah.
okay, maybe you should do some more cardio or some kind of exercise,
Yeah.
or whether it's weightlifting, depending on the
Some things are changing. For instance, with continuous glucose monitoring systems, and like multiple, you have this continuous time interval sampling of blood pressure now, for instance, compared to previously just one measurement. So I think some things are changing, not thinking in terms of dynamic systems, but definitely in terms of based on some trial and error learning, in that landscape. Yeah.
What I have seen in dynamical systems approaches for psychiatry is some work recently where people are trying to use a multidimensional space to think in terms of this cognitive disorder versus that cognitive disorder versus that one. And rather than treating them like they're just a list,
Yeah.
a laundry list of diagnoses that we have little parameters for, to if you pass these tests, then you've got that one. And if you pass those tests, you got that one. If you look at the way comorbidity happens among these various cognitive disorders or psychological disorders, look at the way they interact with one another and build a kind of state space that shows which ones are near each other, which ones are far apart from one another. That I have seen people working on to try to get a better understanding of, inspired in part by a dynamical systems approach, a better understanding of how to treat these things, how to prevent them, and how to understand why they happen in the first place.
I mean, implicitly, a lot of machine learning with big data in medicine is also doing the same thing. Not definitely acknowledging the idea, but it's trying to figure out those interstitial spaces.
Exactly.
Right. No, that's fascinating. So I think you have covered for the most part the dynamic systems. I mean, where do you see the most excitement? I mean, as scientists, it's the aha movement, and it's the next big thing, which kind of motivates us, right, to spend the number of hours we spend and, all the brain power we kind of throw at these problems. So where do you see the next excitement, at least for yourself?
For myself, where I see some of this is happening in my lab, but a lot of it's happening in other labs. I haven't been able to get all my grad students excited about it all the time, but I've got some students who are working on this kind of thing. Is if that representational capacity that's enabled by interactionism can't help but spread through the body and outside the body, and so your relationship with other objects and other people, those relationships are part of your cognition, then you want to study ecologically valid scenarios of things like joint action and coordinated action. Shared cognition is a term that I like to use for describing really good joint action, is a kind of shared cognition. And so, my former grad students, Daniel Richardson and Rick Dale, 20 years ago now, first were doing, showing that people's eyes are coordinated. When one person's looking at a display while they're talking about that set of faces, and another person is listening on headphones to that conversation, they will look at some of those same faces. And so these eyes get coordinated over time. There's a bit of a lag. Then it's a unidirectional conversation, just a monologue. But then if you get those people, Daniel Richardson and Natasha Kirkham and Rick Dale had two people with two eye trackers in two labs with a headset and headphones. So they're having a live conversation, just like we are now, interrupting each other. They didn't see each other, but they saw a painting that they're looking at, the same painting. I think it was Salvador Dali's Melting Clocks painting. And they're just talking unscripted about that picture, and interrupting each other and completing each other's sentences and having a good, proper conversation. And sure enough, that lag that used to be there for looking at the same thing a little bit later, now was pretty much at the same time. They're looking at the same parts of the display at the same time. And this was before hyperscanning became popular. But if two people's eyes, oculomotor systems, are doing the same thing at the same time, it's safe to guess that there's some correlation in their brain activity.
Right.
And sure enough, later studies, Anna Kulin and John Dylan Haynes and Yuri Hassan and others have been doing stuff where they show the brains are correlated when they're in a conversation here. And so this is some of the stuff I get really excited about. Kevin Shockley showed postural sway gets correlated when people are talking.
Right.
And
Steve Harrison. Steve Harrison has some work on with horsing task.
Exactly. So all these things. And Ramesh Balasubramaniam has work where people get coordinated with the tool they're using. I think the work that you've done with Damien Kelty-Steven on looking at a tensegrity object of this embodied organism, that kind of tensegrity, that balance of tensional forces that make this organism, its brain and its body, a balanced, coherent system, that tensegrity often spreads to other people. And so that's what some of the exciting things is that I think is where now that we are moving in a direction, I think, in cognitive science that feels like we've learned a lot about how an individual organism works in its interaction with a particular narrow context. And we're drifting toward more ecologically valid scenarios that usually have at least another tool in that environment or another person in that environment. Those ecologically valid systems are going to show Susan Hurley's prediction to be right, that the interactions can't help but spread. And if you look at cognition, you're going to find it everywhere.
It's so fascinating that the neuroscience community, for instance, the work of Miguel Nicolelis at Duke, where he had this experiment where there were monkeys in different rooms, and they all had an electrode, in the brain. And finally, they had to do like this ball and bar task where they have to prevent the ball falling or something along that line. But the three monkeys have to solve it together because contribution from each of those brains was required to solve the task. It was very quick that they learned, and the three brains started coordinating just by, they had visual feedback, but the output was, just the electrode from the brain.
Wow.
Right? I mean, the interesting thing is that neuroscience did not, like, as an enterprise, did not pick up as an embodied and as a representational flowing out kind of idea. And I think it got stuck in like the technicalities rather than the implications for that. But yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and we can not just study humans. I mean, we can study human-dog interact. I mean, like two different species with different brain structures.
Oh yeah.
One not having a language system, being able to coordinate with that language system would be very fascinating to see.
There is some fascinating work looking at yawn contagion between dogs and their owners. That's pretty amazing stuff where it recognizes the sound of their owner's yawn.
Oh, it's I forgot the name of the primatologist, the famous one at Amory, not Caroline Scheich. So he has some work on contagion in apes. So seemingly, yawns are very contagious. So when you see a group of chimpanzees yawning, within a few, minutes, you will see almost all chimpanzees yawning. So and who knows, whether it's just visual or it's hormonal or more than that.
And cross-species versions of that is pretty exciting.
Yes. And some of the things, we have an essay in the book on olfaction. Olfaction is something which we are still trying to understand in terms of it has a lot of quantum components which we did not understand, because two chemical compounds which are very different, but with the same state of electron in certain region can produce similar kind of odor. So we don't think in terms of olfaction, but how much of embodied cognition and attraction and a lot of other things are based on hormones and pheromones and chemical signaling, which it's so hard to study.
Exactly, but that's a powerful example of embodiment. And of course, we're not exchanging scents and olfactory and hormones in this conversation. We're also not exchanging half of our gestures, right? So there's
right.
In a real scenario where you're actually sitting with that person, you see more of the body. And so you're going to get more of those gestures that aren't hidden inside a Zoom frame. You're going to get scents and smells and all kinds of other context elements that are ignored in so many experiments. And if you can just get some measurements of all those things, I think you'll find that they're relevant, that these are context effects in an old-fashioned framework, but it just shows that everything is connected to everything.
Right. It's very profound. So now coming on like some of the methodological issues. So for instance, 1/f, right? So based on your understanding, how powerful are these methods to have the resolution? Because behavior is extremely varied. Like we cannot count the states, for instance. Like, it's just uncountable. 1/f noise, when you're looking at the spectrum, the slopes, it has a range in which it can vary, right? So so is that a bottleneck in terms of how we can describe, behavior using these techniques? Because we are mostly dealing with bounded ranges, these kind of ideas. Does it have a resolution?
So you're concerned about the part of a 1 over f slope where it
Yeah,
falls off and is no longer linear, and is that
it's
a
no longer
frequency
linear,
that?
so definitely there are issues with scales,
Uh-huh.
as well as there are issues with like boundedness of the slope, for instance, right? There's
Okay.
a
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right, and that brings back to when you talk about interactions. One can ask, like, when you're talking about interactions, it's a little vague, because when you move from these boxes with arrows in between to interactions happening, are these interactions at the level of boxes, like sub boxes, at the level of neurons or ensemble of neurons? At what exactly scale are we talking about interactions that matter, or it matters with interactions across all scales? So what exactly is the scale of analysis, or scale
For
at
an
which we find
interaction, yeah.
signatures?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is still very useful to acknowledge that certain parts of, let's say, the language network,
Mhm.
certain components in that language network are
Yeah,
mostly phonological, and other components are mostly semantic,
yeah.
etc. Um, and so that is a clear recognition that there are some internal computations in that
Mhm.
particular subcomponent that are performing um, important computations that are relatively specific to something like phonology or semantics. But then when you see context effects, David Gao has amazing demonstrations of context effects and between brain regions doing
Yeah.
MEG and fMRI, and getting Granger causality analysis to track the changes over time in one brain region with the changes over time with another brain region. And let's say it's semantics and phonetics that you're looking at. Um, you can find out when there's some fluctuations up and then down and then up again for one of those areas, and then see a similar correlated change up and then down and then up again, and look at the time constant of that correlation and which one, the phonetics area or the semantics region, is leading the charge on that correlation. Which one is sort of in a Granger
Yeah.
causality
Hmm.
context, which one is responsible for influencing the other one, and that's why they're correlated.
Hmm.
And that's one way he was able to show that there are semantic effects on phonological processing. So that, normally you would build your good old fashioned box and arrow model to have a phonology box followed by a semantic box, and there'd be a feed forward flow
Yeah.
there. But clearly he was able to demonstrate with Granger causality analysis for some MEG data that the semantics system knows enough about phonology to give the phonological system some guidance about, hey, we've collected a few phonemes that might be this word. Maybe you should start leaning toward this word, even though you haven't heard all its phonemes yet. That's what a context effect is, and that it's often a kind of predictive process, just due to a pattern completion flow of, I've gotten these phonemes. This word seems likely, so maybe you should expect this final phoneme coming up
Yeah.
to complete this word. That's what Jay McClellan and Jeff Ellman's trace connectionist model of spoken word recognition was doing
Right.
40 years ago, of having a word
I
node
want to
connect.
clarify here. I want to clarify here. You're not saying that brain is trying to compute or like somehow estimate the probabilities, but the structure itself is primed to work in a fashion
This is
which
so important.
corresponds to certain probabilities, right?
This is so important. So,
Yeah.
I brought up the word predictive processing, and that does sort of uh,
Yeah.
summon the notion of a prediction module that a lot of Bayesian researchers have kind of proposed, a
Yeah.
system that might be specific to language, or maybe works across multiple cognitive systems and is able to take a current set of inputs and predict the next input.
Yeah.
And that prediction module is going to use a Bayesian probabilistic approach. That would be a sensible way to have that thing work. In what I'm describing here, especially referring to an elegant little connectionist model from 1986, the
Yeah.
trace model of spoken word recognition, it performs predictions. A lexical node will get active because it's received input from some phonemes that are consistent with it. And even though that set of phonemes have not been fully input to the network yet, because it's only halfway through hearing the word, if
Mhm.
that lexical node is especially active, it will send feedback
Mhm.
to all the phonemes that belong to it, in a pattern completion process. It's not
Yeah.
a prediction module. It's just saying, these
Yeah.
are the phonemes down here that belong to this word. So if I'm getting pretty active, I'm going to spread activation to all the phonemes that make me up, even the phoneme that hasn't been heard yet. And so that phoneme node gets partially active due to feedback, even though that phoneme has not been entered into the input system yet. And so partway through hearing this word,
Yeah.
this network can start to anticipate that word that it's halfway through hearing, and even anticipate phonemes that it hasn't heard yet. It's a predictive like process resulting purely due to pattern completion.
Yes.
And so Ben Falandes and Benny Nguyen and I have a paper from a few years ago in Brain Sciences that essentially says, is prediction just pattern completion? And we
Yeah.
show some examples, a discussion of the trace model, and also a new model that Ben Falandes developed that kind of shows how you can get a lot of predictive-like phenomena out of a system that's really just trying to fill in the gaps in its
Yeah.
pattern that it's trying to complete. And that pattern completion process often looks like a prediction system.
Right. It's a very, very important distinction, which, several times we miscommunicate, across different domains of computer science. No, that's really wonderful. I think we have covered a lot of grounds regarding, your approach, as well as how it ties to, the broader theme of ecological psychology, interaction dominant dynamics, and the issue of scale, which is so profound, whenever we are talking about, any complex system, and often don't acknowledge that we are looking at a specific scale, or there can be scales, around that. So, Spivey, do you have any recommendations for like young researchers now who are just starting their journey in cognitive sciences and neurosciences, who should think more pragmatically? They have to kind of manage the realities of having an academic, sustaining an academic research program, along with being honest, and integrated with, these ideas if we subscribe to them, and what kind of training is required right now. We covered, like, for instance, like linear mod training in linear statistics might not help in the long run. So what kind of training and what kind of strategy one should, look forward to as a young academician?
I think right now, the kind of training that grad students should be looking for is a mix. And so in the same way that I don't think it's going to help anybody to be
Yeah.
trying to say we should stop using the word representation, there might be some truth to that, but it's not going to help you get a job. It's not going to help you appeal to the mainstream of cognitive science that really cognitive science broadly writ, so including cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology, etc. That broad span of cognitive science still thinks that representation is a useful way to think about stuff, and there's some truth to that. And so, sort of pretending that we should completely get rid of it isn't going to work for you, and it's probably not 100% true. I think there is representational capacity happening, as we said, in a mind, and it's not being presented to a homunculus, and it's not individuated into countable representations, but it is an intermediating process, not an intermediating state between that stimulation and that behavior, but it's an intermediating process that we shouldn't ignore. And so, some extremist ecological psychologists have said we can ignore the brain and just look at this flowing stimulation to that flowing behavior. Yeah. And behaviorists were kind of thrown out of the building 50 years ago for saying that that stimulus and that individual response is all we need to care about, and the intervening black box can be ignored. That turned out to not be a successful way. It also turned out to be wrong. You can get a whole lot out of studying black box, especially now with good neuroscience methods. So my advice to grad students who are flirting with dynamical systems ideas is to don't overdo it. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't throw out representationalism completely, for pragmatic reasons as well as theoretical reasons.
Yeah.
But definitely encourage your co-authors, your colleagues, your peers to rethink what representation can be. And one of the ways to really, I think, wrap your head around the temporal dynamics being more important than the idea of a state-based representation is to experiment with computational simulations. And so I encourage grad students to play around with neural network simulations that you can really look inside of. Don't use a click and point package that doesn't let you see inside the network. Write it from scratch if you've got the right kind of training, because then you can easily look inside.
So just by saying that, you are proposing a very different kind of training, especially for students in the psychology departments, because you can graduate right now without knowing a single line of code in several instances.
Yeah, within a psychology department, I think it's heartbreaking that there hasn't been enough emphasis on good coding skills, even for building, just a few lines of code to do a Lorenz attractor. It really is that simple. But it does take some practice to get comfortable with that programming language, whether you're using Python or MATLAB or something else for it. A lot of psychology students are learning good stats with R, and so that's a nice step. If they can get good with some kind of programming, say in R for doing their stats, then they should be able to do the next step and get some practice with Python or MATLAB or something similar to do pretty simple little simulations and look at how those systems can transition between chaotic behavior and periodic behavior and point attractor behavior. Look at how those systems can exhibit emergent properties due to finding interstitial regions in their state space. I mean, an emergent property is essentially something that you didn't expect this complex system to do, but it did anyway. You don't feel like you trained it to do it, but it learned it anyway. And it's something that usually is reasonably describable as living in between the attractor basins or the labeled things that you taught it, this kind of concept and that kind of concept and that kind of concept. And then in between those regions, it developed its own understanding of maybe some super categories that some of these things belong in. And that kind of emergent behavior is something that is not well accounted for by a traditional information processing approach that a lot of psychology grad students are getting exposed to. If they just noodle around with a toy neural network, they'll see it do stuff that I think can help change their mind about traditional approaches and look toward dynamical systems accounts.
I think we need a textbook from you. Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great. So, in our own department here at UC Merced, we have a Cognitive and Information Sciences department.
Yes.
And we sort of name it that way. The PhD is in Cognitive and Information Sciences because we make sure our students get lots of training in coding skills of all kinds. And when I was at Cornell for 12 years, I loved that department. They're wonderful people there. They took good care of me. And I, tried to produce good grad students. And we had a lot of students go into academic positions, but we also had students who weren't productive enough to go into academic positions after they got their PhD. And there's not a whole lot of places you can go.
Right.
The PhD in psychology that isn't academia. You can get a stats job because you're good with stats, And after 12 years of that, coming to UC Merced in a department that gives you a lot more training in coding skills for big data analysis, for data science, and for neural network simulations and similar stuff. These students, the half or so, maybe 1/3 or 2/5 that don't go into academia, they get really good data science jobs. They're not just going to some low-level office where they do some stats for some company. They're up in a nice analyst position where they're going to have some fun looking for patterns in complex data, using the skills they've learned. And it was a wonderful experience for me to see students who don't go into academia, PhD students who don't go into academia, do have a wonderful place to go. And I didn't know about that until
both in terms of compensation as well. I mean, it's generally good for your personal health and financial well-being. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a change I think we academicians should in general embrace, not to produce cookie cutter PhDs, along same traditions, but actually make them capable enough that they can, bifurcate or trifurcate in whichever domains they want to go.
And we've had PhDs that actually succeed at sort of balancing a blend of academic and industry. And when you can do that, you get the best of both worlds.
Right. And actually, I mean, the reality is that industry spends more on R&D right now than public funded research
Yeah,
happens.
yeah,
So we are living in a new reality of research, which was not the case, in earlier times.
yeah.
So that's wonderful. So Spivey, I think we have covered a lot more grounds than I initially planned. It was wonderful. Before closing, I would like to ask you for two more things. One is any new publications or new literature coming out from your lab which we should look forward to, and then what readings would you recommend, like the most existential important readings, you know, which people with similar interest should definitely go through.
So yeah, one of the most recent papers that came out of my lab is work with my grad students Soren Malai and Tyler Margettis. Professor Tyler Margettis and I co-advise Soren. So we have this paper, the three of us, that just came out a couple months ago in Psychological Science, and it's a good old-fashioned embodiment effect that is pretty exciting in the context of problem solving. And so we're looking at ways to, in an embodied fashion, prime two different ways to think about solving a problem. And you can think of it, Thomas Hills has described it as problem solving that uses exploitation or exploration in a state space. So exploitation would be you go to a region in state space and really get all the resources you can in that spot. And exploration would be, so I move to some other place and I'm
it's like levee walking, right?
It's very similar to levee flight. So we cite some of the Turvey and Rhodes and Turvey work, and Thomas Hill's work for a kind of levee flight scenario, where the statistics of that trajectory shows burst to a new location and then a bunch of small movements and then another burst. So squirrels search for food, search for nuts that way, or store their nuts that way. Birds do that same kind of levee flight. And you can do these two different ways of a problem solving and moving around in your mental state space in an exploratory fashion or in an exploitation fashion with two different kinds of tasks. So a word stem completion task says, take the letters S and T and come up with all the words you can come up with that start with ST. And people will just, speak store and stock and stymie and just go for a while. It's sort of, you're moving to a region in your lexical, orthographic and phonological state space to try to find a bunch of things that are near each other in that state space because they start with similar letters or sounds. So that's an exploitation kind of approach. That's a more convergent, let me rephrase that. You're going to a region of state space where you're going to branch off to this instead of that, instead of this, instead of that. So it's actually divergent because you're starting at one spot, but then having to explore to find
within that local region. Yes.
So you start in one region. Sorry for that. And the comparison problem solving we use is the compound remote associates problem, where you get three words that might belong to compound words with using the same word. So it's comb, dripper, and tea. So honeycomb, honey dripper, and honey tea could be the three compounds that you have to find the word honey, because you just heard comb, dripper, and tea. And that missing word is somewhere in that state space. So you hear one word, comb, another dripper, another tea, and you're trying to find where in the state space do I have a word that each of these makes
interesting. Yes.
Compound with it. So that's a more convergent. You're trying to find where in the state space these three landmarks converge to make their compound words. And those are tricky. Both the kinds of problems are tricky. One is definitely an insight problem. This compound remote associates, people will feel like they're at an impasse for a long time and then say, aha, I got it. Or they don't get it at all. And with the word stem word completion, you're going to see more continuous flow of people.
They
run out of ideas and they're paused for a while, then they come up with another one. And you can prime that in an embodied fashion. So we actually got people to do better in one task with one kind of embodied prime and better in the other task with a different embodied prime. And all that embodied prime was to look at a map of Venice, a little cartoon version of a map of Venice. And you're given the instruction to have start and location and deliver a package with your mouse cursor, just draw a line from that spot to another spot to deliver that package, and then do another one and do 5 of them to the same location. And so
I
that's more
see.
convergent.
Yeah.
This embodiment of going to the same location. People primed with that kind of just task before doing the problem solving, they did better with compound remote associates. They get that problem and they had a better chance at finding the solution. And they weren't as good with the STEM completion. They actually produced fewer words given a 30-second period that start with STEM. The other participants were given a task, an embodied task where they're supposed to deliver packages to 5 different locations. And so they're diverging just in their motor movements and their visualization of this task. They're doing a divergent process, distributing packages to 5 different locations. And then you give them the word stem completion, or you give them the compound remote associates, and they behaved better on the STEM completion because it's more of a divergent kind of task, and perform worse on the compound remote associates where you're supposed to converge onto something.
So I'm trying to draw an analogy, in the ecological analogy that the species, for instance, which try to bring food, for instance, they have like a den or like a home place, like a shelter, and they kind of gather food resources, bring in, pile up, like chipmunks or birds and humans, compared to species who basically forage around, move around like that, keep diverging, right? And I don't know, like maybe it has implications for for intelligence, the way we defined and things like that, like how foraging behavior is related to basically your insightful intelligence. Yeah.
And so, we're excited about this sort of demonstration of embodiment, that what you do with your body in a visual motor task changes subtly, but it changes significantly the way you go about solving a problem that requires this kind of thinking or that kind.
So bringing in Levy kind of opened a can of worms, because there are mathematical derivations or theorems where we talk about dimensions. For instance, if you do Levy walk in one dimension, you basically, there's a probability with which you'll come back to you will visit the same space or same state. If you do it in 2D, there's a probability with which you will come back. But if you are doing a Levy walk in 3D, you almost never return to the same state, right? So, when we are talking about brain, there are hyperdimensions, but we also come back to the space. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking, out of my head here. Like maybe we are doing those searches in the brain, not necessarily in a hyperdimensional space, but we are trying. We have some kind of lower dimensional representations, and within those we do, these walks.
I tend to think that the lower dimensional representations are good ways for a scientist to envision the data. I don't have a good understanding of exactly how a brain would do its own dimensionality reduction and function in that reduced dimensional space. But it's definitely the case that, the concerns with Levy flight, there's other kinds of equations that will give you these kinds of bursty behaviors. Some are memory-less, and some include some memory. And I think rather than assuming that you have to reduce the dimensionality, or that the brain is reducing the dimensionality in order to produce the right kind of data or behavior, it could be that looking at equations or systems that are similar to Levy, but not quite the same, and still in a high dimensional state space, will get you the data, get you fitting of the data.
Right. Makes sense. That's awesome. And then finally, some recommended readings from you, some most important recommended readings.
So for beginners, I would recommend Louis Favella's recent Radical Embodied Neuroscience textbook. I'm not sure that's exactly the title, but it's close. And this just came out this year. I think this is a really good introduction to complex systems as a way to think about what a neural system is doing. And it's going to be significantly different from a traditional box and arrow representationalist account that a lot of neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists get trained in. And I think Louis Favella's book will pull them out of that way of thinking a little bit at an introductory level. And so more complex, I think, might be the second edition of Michael Anderson's book on neural reuse. And it's phrenology is in the title. of that book. He's got a second edition that came out very recently, just updatings of the basic story, which is that neural systems have a lot of interaction among each other. And the reason they do is because they weren't designed as encapsulated modules thanks to natural selection. Natural selection actually preserves a lot of the systems that other primates and other mammals before them even had in their brains, that we can see they have in their brains. And the neural reuse is a theory suggesting that a lot of our cortical brain areas that we think are doing something unique and special, like language or logical reasoning, they're actually systems that used to do simpler stuff for other animals, and they ramped up in a quantitative fashion. They are improved, I guess, in a human brain, but they're not qualitatively different. They're not a module that we have and those other animals don't have. It's that old module just souped up a little bit. And that has powerful consequences for the way you think about what a neural system is doing when it's trying to perform formal logic in a human mind, or trying to perform language skills in a human mind. It's not a Chomskyan module language organ the way he proposed in the 1960s.
Right. Great. And any recommendations at the level of understanding neural networks, especially in the context of brain sciences?
Yeah. So books to read that will for a grad student to get. Yeah. To actually be building them. So there's Randy O'Reilly has a series of books, and I think second and third editions, and his wife Yuko Munakata has co-authored some of those. I think those connectionist model books that are now referred to as neural networks instead of connectionists. The O'Reilly and Munakata books, I think, are really useful ways to get introduced to some neural networks that are complex enough to do really impressive things, and simple enough that you can still look inside them and figure out and treat them like a real experiment and not a black box.
Okay. Thanks, Spivey. This was wonderful communication. Really, really amazing. And I hope our listeners will also, get a lot from this discussion. I think we touched the surface of a lot of things in the interest of time, as well as in the interest of the new audience. But hopefully you'll be willing to discuss many of these issues in much greater detail
I'd be happy
in the future.
I had a great time. This was really fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Spivey, and we'll be in touch.
Excellent.
Have a great day.
Take care.